Hello, this is Myra Elaine on the Buying Space channel. Today I'm in the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We have some fresh flowers in the house today. Uh, Sunday is Marty's 30th birthday. And I was sneezing and I just figured out it's the flowers. So I'm in Luke chapter 13, in verse 20. And I'm just going to read two verses. The parable of the yeast. He also asked, now this is after the parable of the mustard seed, which I covered last week. He also asked, what else is the kingdom of God like? It is like the yeast a woman used in making bread. Even though she put only a little yeast in 3 measures of flour, it permeated every part of the dough. So here we have Jesus Christ comparing the kingdom of God like the spreading of yeast in dough. So planting that little mustard seed that grows into a bush or a tree with people can permeate throughout the world, throughout your neighborhood, throughout society. Just that little tablespoon or teaspoon of yeast in that big bowl of dough. And what happens with that big ball of dough? It gets bigger and it makes wonderful bread. It makes our daily bread. And that's meant on a physical level and a spiritual level. This same parable is in Matthew, and it says exactly the same thing almost. It's worded a little bit differently, and then it goes on to say that Jesus talked in parables. Mark does not have an equivalent of the parable of the yeast, and neither does John. But when I read that and I thought about the yeast, in this case, in the New Testament, when Jesus talks about the yeast, it's a positive thing. It's the spreading of the gospel throughout the region, throughout the globe, throughout the world, that the gospel has spread. But yeast has a weird history with the Jewish people, and Jesus was Jewish. So I'm going to go back to the first Passover. I think it's in Exodus 12. This is when they were still in Egypt and Pharaoh wasn't letting them go. And it gives instructions for the Passover in Exodus 12. It talks about the lamb and slaughtering the lamb. And it talks about putting the blood over the doorpost. Talks about strangers and circumcision. Wasn't good to be a tourist. Let's see. Okay. It's a while before I went to record this. I found it immediately. Or maybe it's further back. The first Passover. Take special care of the chosen animals in chapter 12 too. That's what I bet it was in this chapter. Okay, tells them how to be dressed even. Here we go, starting in verse 14. This is a day to remember. Each year, from generation to generation, you must celebrate it as a special festival to the Lord. It is the law for all time. For 7 days, the bread you eat must be without yeast. On the first day of the festival, remove every trace of yeast from your homes. Anyone who eats bread made from yeast during the 7 days of the festival will be cut off from the community of Israel. On the first day of the festival and again on the 7th day, all people must observe an official day for holy assembly. No work. And it goes on from there, all the rules about Passover and about how there's not even to be yeast in the house or you'll be excommunicated. Poor grandma, she got yeast on something by mistake. And then in Levitical laws, if your offering is grain offering baked in an oven, it must be made of choice flour, but without any yeast. So the sacrificial offerings made in the tabernacle and later in the temple could not have yeast. That was 2 verse 11. And here we go to chapter 6, sins requiring a guilt offering. And here we talk about burnt offerings. Okay, changing of the garments. Grain offerings. Here we go. Aaron and his sons may eat the rest of the flour, but it must be baked without yeast and eaten in a sacred place within the courtyard of the tabernacle. So the bread put on the altar to be burnt couldn't have any yeast in it. And any bread that was given to the priests, the Levites, could not have yeast in it. So what was the deal with yeast? This was extended to wine and honey. And those 3 things, yeast for bread or yeast of any kind, wine and honey, all have something in common. They all ferment. So there's something going on inside that's changing and transforming honey and wine and bread, or yeast for bread. It transforms the bread. And it became associated with false teaching and sin. And in the tabernacle, they want everything purified. They don't want anything growing. They had to take the tabernacle down and move it. When they moved, they had to store things in a desert. And, you know, when they had to set everything back up and everything had to be purified and clean. So they didn't want unleavened bread, or they didn't want leavened bread with yeast in it throughout the entire Old Testament. But when we get to the New Testament, here is Jesus Christ telling a parable about the yeast being the kingdom of God, spreading the kingdom of God. See, Jewish people really understood the difference between leavened bread and unleavened bread, and had to be concerned about whether they even had yeast in their household during Passover. They couldn't even have it in their house, or they would be excommunicated. So Jesus used that. I mean, we look at it and it's like, oh, it's yeast. Jewish people know that, observe Passover, know that you do not use yeast in your bread during Passover. Have it in your house. It's a big deal. Everybody that's Jewish and practices their religion at all knows this. Jesus was Jewish. The people he was talking to were Jewish. So using that as a positive example for the kingdom of God, everybody knew just a little bit of yeast would ruin your unleavened bread and make it leaven. They knew how fast yeast would spread through dough, because they had to be so cautious about it at the time they didn't use it. So Jesus was giving, we just think, well, that's kind of a shallow example, but there was history and culture behind it. I mean, it's just two little verses, but it meant a great deal. And the people around him that heard this understood this to a greater level than most Christians do today. Even modern day Jews that practice would understand what Jesus was saying to a deeper level. So that was the parable for the day, the parable of the woman kneading the yeast into the dough. And next week we'll cover fruits and vegetables. No, we won't. I'm just joking. But you all have a wonderful and blessed day.